Great. Good morning. Well, my name is Paul Gunning. I'm the Director of the Climate Change Division at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. On behalf of EPA and the Office of Air and Radiation, I would like to welcome you to today's public hearing. Thank you all for taking the time out to come and participate and communicate with us today. As you all know, just to be clear, the title of today's hearing is Proposed Finding that Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Aircraft Cause or Contribute to Air Pollution that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare, and the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. I'd like to again thank you all for coming today, and let me start by introducing my fellow panel members. Start down on the far left, please.
Lena Williams, Office of General Counsel.
Mike Smolsky, Director of Large Marine and Aviation Center.
I'm Bill Charmley, the Director of the Assessment and Standards Division.
Brian Manning from the Large Marine and Aviation Center.
Leslie Gentarasmi from the Climate Change Division.
Thank you. Just to reiterate, the purpose of the hearing today is to receive comments from all interested parties on the proposed endangerment finding and advance notice of proposed rulemaking. This action, as many of you know, was published in the Federal Register on July 1st, 2015. In this action, the Administrator is proposing to determine that greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere endanger the public health and welfare of current and future generations within the meaning of Section 231A of the Clean Air Act. In addition, the Administrator is proposing to find that greenhouse gas emissions from certain classes of engines used primarily in commercial aircraft are contributing to this mix of greenhouse gas air pollution in our atmosphere. Today's hearing provides interested persons the opportunity for oral presentations and views and arguments. Witnesses will be allowed to make oral statements which they may later expand on in writing for the record. When you are finished with your comments, members of this panel may ask clarifying questions. However, this hearing is not intended to be a discussion of the proposed findings or the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. While we might ask questions or request additional data or supporting materials, we will not respond to comments in this forum. Instead, we ask that you please provide written comments as part of the record in finalizing this proposal. If any members of the audience today that wish to testify have not already signed up, please submit your name at the registration table back at the entrance in the room in the foyer. Everyone attending here today should sign in regardless of whether or not you are scheduled to testify. Finally, before I turn it to my colleague Bill, let me remind everyone that in addition to today's hearing, there is also an opportunity to send us written comments. Comment period closes on August 31st, 2015 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Details on where to submit written comments can be found in the Federal Register notice that announced this proposal, as well as on our website and the fact sheet that is available out at the registration desk. So with that as an introduction, let me turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Concurrent with these proposed findings, on July 1, 2015, EPA also issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, referred to as an ANPR, to provide additional information on the process for setting an aircraft engine greenhouse gas standard under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act, should the EPA issue positive final endangerment and contribution findings under Section 231. The ANPR largely focuses on recent efforts to set an international CO2 emission standard for aircraft at the International Civil Aviation Organization, also referred to as ICAO, and how those efforts may inform EPA's future action. This advance notice describes and seeks input on issues related to setting an international CO2 standard for aircraft and the potential use of Section 231 of the Clean Air Act to adopt and implement a possibly corresponding international aircraft engine CO2 or greenhouse gas emission standards domestically. This international CO2 standard is expected to be adopted by ICAO in early 2016. EPA is requesting comment on a number of issues related to setting a CO2 or greenhouse gas emission standard for aircraft, and these include the appropriate effective dates for potential standards, the appropriate stringency level for a standard, and whether standards should apply to new in-production aircraft as well as new type aircraft. Now let me go over how we will be conducting today's hearing. We are conducting this hearing under Section 307D of the Clean Air Act to provide interested persons an opportunity for oral presentation, in addition to written submissions on the proposed findings. We are having this hearing recorded, and the transcripts will be available for public inspection and copying in EPA's air and radiation docket at docket number EPA HQ OAR 2014-0828. The transcripts will also be available electronically on EPA's website and on the regulations.gov website in the same docket number. The official record of this hearing will be kept open for 30 days after today to provide opportunity to submit rebuttal and supplementary testimony. You may submit this additional testimony to the same docket for this action by using one of the methods described in the Federal Register notice announcing the proposal. This hearing will be conducted informally, and formal rules of evidence will not apply. Paul and I will be serving as the co-presiding officers for today's hearing, and as such, we are authorized to apply reasonable limits on the duration of the statements of any witness. Each person will be given no more than 10 minutes to provide his or her verbal testimony. Paul and I have asked EPA personnel at this table to serve as timekeepers, so right down here, to keep close track of testimony times. A timekeeper will indicate to each testifier when you have 5 minutes left, and also when you have 1 minute left and when your time is finished. Please be courteous to those who follow you and keep your comments to no more than 10 minutes. We will be using a group format for today's testimony. 3 individuals at a time will be called up to the testifier's table here in the front. If you have not already done so, please check in at the registration desk for your group number assignment. When you hear your name or your group number called, please make your way to the table provided at the front of the room and be prepared to provide your testimony in succession. Witnesses must state their name and affiliation prior to making their statement. Please speak slowly and clearly so our court recorder can record these proceedings accurately. In order to streamline the process, members of each group should be in the room in advance of their projected group time and should be prepared to make their way to the front of the room while the previous members are giving their testimony. And depending on the number of testifiers that we have today, we may end up taking a break during the day. Finally, while the EPA representative speaking today will attempt to ensure the accuracy of any description we provide or discussion of the proposal in the ANPR, the official version of the proposal in the ANPR that is published in the Federal Register on July 1st of 2015, and it controls any cases of conflict between it and what you may hear today. Please refer to the official version when developing your written comments on the proposal or on the ANPR. Thank you. And with that, we'd like to call the first group of witnesses to speak in this order. Dr. Nick Lutze from the International Council on Clean Transportation, Nancy Young from Airlines for America, and Nancy Kruger from the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to give these remarks. My name is Nick Lutze. I'm a program director at the International Council on Clean Transportation. The ICCT is an independent nonprofit organization founded to provide first-rate, unbiased research and technical analysis to environmental regulators. The ICCT appreciates the opportunity to provide this testimony on EPA's aviation endangerment finding and advance notice of proposed rulemaking on aviation greenhouse gas emissions. Our comments are informed by the engagement of ICCT staff in environmental working groups to the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, since 2008. In particular, since 2009, we've contributed technical analysis to efforts to develop the International Carbon Dioxide, or CO2 standard that is referenced heavily within the ANPR. Our comments will focus on the following points. First, the scope of the endangerment finding. Second, the applicability, timing, and stringency of an international or domestic CO2 emission standard. And third, potential domestic reporting requirements for aviation manufacturers under the Clean Air Act. EPA has proposed that the endangerment finding focus on 6 key greenhouse gases. We concur with this general approach with caveats. We agree with EPA's assessment that scientific uncertainties on the climate impact of nitrogen oxides, or NOx, and water vapor emitted at altitude remain high enough so as not to address them in this initial endangerment finding. The science regarding the contribution of black carbon to climate change, on the other hand, is clear. Black carbon was identified as the second most important contributor to anthropogenic emissions in 2013. To reflect the latest science, EPA should consider incorporating black carbon in its final aviation endangerment finding. Also, while we do not support integrating cruise NOx under the endangerment finding, EPA should consider expanding its existing NOx reporting requirement for aircraft engine manufacturers from only landing and takeoff emissions to include cruise emissions. ICAO has outlined two general approaches for the applicability of an international CO2 emission standard. In the first approach, only new aircraft designs being type certified for the first time be required to comply. In the second, that all new aircraft delivered after a certain date, that is, both new designs and new in-production aircraft, would need to pass. Based upon our analysis, covering all new aircraft delivered after a certain date will be necessary for the standard to significantly reduce emissions beyond business as usual. Since new type aircraft are rare, our analysis suggests that a new type only standard beginning in 2020 would only cover about 5% of the global fleet in 2030, as opposed to a requirement after affecting all new aircraft, which could cover more than half of the global fleet that year. Furthermore, we do not expect a new type only standard to reduce emissions below business as usual because of the definition that ICAO has chosen of technological feasibility. In 2013, ICAO decided that only technologies widely available for deployment in 2016 across multiple aircraft types will be considered in establishing stringency. A standard implemented in 2020 for new applications for type certification will affect aircraft types with entry into service of 2024 or later due to the time required for certification. This time lag, combined with the decision that at most the standards can require state-of-the-art 2016 technologies when implemented, means that even the most aggressive standard will lag the fuel efficiency of new type aircraft when they enter into service. For these reasons, we conclude that covering all new aircraft will be required to meet the purpose of the standard to reduce emissions beyond business as usual. On stringency, we believe that an international and/or domestic CO2 standard should be set to require at least state-of-the-art 2016 technologies for new aircraft types certified after the standard takes effect. ICAO is also investigating a tiered approach under which deliveries of new in-production aircraft or models that are type certified before the standard takes effect may have separate targets applied to them. Pending additional analysis, a lower stringency level may be appropriate for those types, but still within the highest 3 levels identified by EPA in the ANPRM. On timing, in order to minimize the number of years that a new type regulatory level lags business as usual aircraft, the standard should be applied for new types as early as possible, in this case 2020. Early implementation for new in-production aircraft, either in 2020 or 2023, is also preferable. Finally, since current discussions on an international emissions standard assume a static stringency level, it would be appropriate for the U.S. to press for early ICAO review of any international CO2 standard starting in 2019 so that the updated requirements are in place to drive additional technology development beyond 2020. Regarding manufacturer reporting requirements, we recommend that EPA consider adopting a domestic reporting requirement for cruise CO2 and NOx under the Clean Air Act. ICAO is considering the development of a voluntary database for CO2 only. We believe that detailed mandatory reporting is necessary to ensure transparency and a level playing field across manufacturers. Finally, as noted before, we believe that the collection of cruise NOx data domestically would help improve our understanding of the climate impact of aviation NOx emissions. EPA would need to analyze the cost and complexity of developing measurement and reporting protocols for cruise NOx if it decides to pursue this approach. Our more detailed comments will be submitted to EPA in writing. In addition, we will submit an update to the 2009 study referenced in the ANPRM entitled Efficiency Trends for New Commercial Jet Aircraft to the public docket. The two studies together highlight the importance of a meaningful CO2 emission standard to the U.S.'s aviation greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. Thank you for the opportunity to comment here today and for EPA's continuing work on this very important topic.
My name is Nancy Young. I'm the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for Airlines for America, representing the major passenger and cargo airlines in the United States. We appreciate this opportunity to testify regarding EPA's proposed findings on aircraft greenhouse gas emissions and advance notice of proposed rulemaking. As the record of our members demonstrates, we take our role in controlling greenhouse gas emissions very seriously. For the past several decades, U.S. airlines have dramatically improved fuel efficiency and reduced carbon dioxide emissions by investing billions in fuel-saving aircraft and engines, innovative technologies like winglets, and cutting-edge route optimization software. As a result, although U.S. airlines comprise 5% of U.S. economic activity, they account for only 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The industry has improved fuel efficiency 120% since 1978, saving 3.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, the equivalent of taking 23 million cars off the road each of those years. Further, the U.S. airlines carried 20% more passengers and cargo in 2014 than they did in 2000, while emitting 8% less carbon dioxide. Despite the industry's strong record to date, however, we are not stopping there. The U.S. airlines are active participants in a global aviation coalition that is committed to 1.5% annual average fuel efficiency improvements through 2020 and carbon neutral growth from 2020, subject to critical aviation infrastructure and technology advances achieved by government and industry. Our members are keenly focused on these advances, both at the national and international levels. For example, the U.S. airlines are partnering to modernize the air traffic management system and to reinvigorate research and development in aviation environmental technology. In addition, we are dedicated to developing commercially viable, sustainable alternative aviation fuel, which could further reduce aviation's greenhouse gas emissions while enhancing U.S. energy independence and security. A4A is a founding member of the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative, a public-private partnership with FAA and other stakeholders that is working on the development and deployment of such fuels. Having helped lay the necessary technical groundwork, A4A members have already begun to use biojet fuel on commercial flights. Further, our industry coalition is supporting the development of a global carbon emissions offset mechanism that could be used to fill the gap should concerted industry and government investments in technology, operations, and infrastructure measures otherwise not allow us to achieve our goal of carbon neutral growth from 2020. It's against this backdrop that A4A welcomes the opportunity to submit a full set of comments on EPA's proposed findings and ANPR by the August 31 comment deadline. For purposes of this hearing, A4A offers 5 preliminary observations. First, A4A concurs with EPA that it is appropriate for the agency to limit its endangerment and cause or contribute findings to the 6 well-mixed, long-lived greenhouse gas emissions. As EPA points out in its proposal, aircraft only emit 2 of those 6 emissions, 99% of which is carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide is directly related to fuel burn, and with jet fuel as the #1 cost for commercial airlines, A4A members already have a powerful incentive to continue to reduce CO2 output. Second, A4A urges EPA to keep our industry's strong fuel efficiency record, relative greenhouse gas emissions contribution, and global sectoral approach commitment squarely in mind as the agency proceeds. Indeed, commercial aviation accounts for 2% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, while the sources EPA previously has sought to cover with greenhouse gas emissions regulations, on-road motor vehicles and power plants, respectively account for 23% and 31%. Third, given the industry's demonstrated fuel efficiency record and economic incentive to continue that trend, there's a real question as to whether any EPA regulation of greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft engines is needed. That said, as aviation is a global industry with airlines operating internationally and manufacturers selling their aircraft in international markets, it is critical that aircraft emission standards be set at the international level and not imposed unilaterally. Accordingly, we appreciate the direct engagement of EPA and FAA in the development of the aircraft carbon dioxide certification standard at the International Civil Aviation Organization, the United Nations body charged with setting standards and recommended practices for international aviation. Not only is the ICAO process for setting aircraft standards highly rigorous, but the ICAO criteria for adopting such standards align well with the criteria under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act. Fourth, A4A strongly supports EPA's stated intent to adopt the future ICAO CO2 certification standard into U.S. law, consistent with the Clean Air Act, its treaty obligations, and in harmony with the international community. Finally, A4A urges EPA to take note of the fact that the future ICAO CO2 certification standard for new aircraft is but one arrow in the aviation industry's quiver for meeting its emissions goals. FAA's Next Gen initiative, public-private research and development partnerships, are collaborative efforts to deploy sustainable alternative aviation fuels at commercial scale, and a vast array of additional operational and infrastructure initiatives being undertaken by airlines, airports, manufacturers, and other stakeholders are also critical arrows in that quiver. Commercial aviation has an important role to play in how America responds to climate change. Be assured that A4A and our members are committed to doing our part. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Kruger, Deputy Director of NACA, the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Thank you for this opportunity to testify and provide preliminary comments of NACA on EPA's proposed aircraft endangerment finding and advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, seeking input on ICAO's ongoing development of international aircraft standards for CO2 and also the potential forthcoming development by EPA of an aircraft carbon dioxide emissions standard. NACA is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan association of air pollution control agencies in 41 states, the District of Columbia, 4 territories, and 116 metropolitan areas. Our members, our professionals in our member agencies have vast experience in improving air quality in the U.S., and our testimony is based on that experience. First, with respect to the endangerment finding, NACA commends EPA and supports it on its proposal to find that GHG concentrations in the atmosphere endanger the public health and welfare of current and future generations within the meaning of Section 231A of the Clean Air Act, to find that GHG emissions from certain aircraft classes cause or contribute to air pollution that endangers public health and welfare, and also to use the same definition of air pollution under Section 231A as the agency used in making its 2009 endangerment finding with respect to motor vehicles. EPA states in its proposal that the 2009 endangerment finding is firmly established and well settled, and that there is no need to reopen or revisit it in order to make an additional finding under Section 231. NACA agrees and supports EPA's proposal to make such an additional finding now. EPA's proposed finding under Section 231 sets the stage for harmonizing international and U.S. aircraft CO2 emission standards. With ICAO expected to adopt an international standard as early as February of 2016, we appreciate EPA's request through the ANPR for input on establishing that standard and the potential use of Clean Air Act Section 231 to adopt and implement the ICAO standard domestically. NACA supports the United States' continued support for adopting an international standard, as well as EPA adoption of a domestic standard that will address this source category in a significant way. Aircraft represent the single largest U.S. transportation source of greenhouse gas emissions not yet subject to greenhouse gas standards. Clearly, this is a sector that merits regulation commensurate with other transportation sectors. ICAO and EPA must establish as rigorous and comprehensive a regulatory package as possible. In the U.S., this is especially critical because state and local air pollution control agencies do not have authority under the Federal Clean Air Act to regulate aircraft emissions beyond the limits set by EPA. Accordingly, NACA offers the following overarching preliminary comments on three key issues highlighted in the ANPR: applicability, timing, and stringency of an aircraft CO2 emissions standard. ICAO is considering various approaches for the applicability of an aircraft CO2 standard, with the fundamental question being whether that standard should apply to in-production aircraft or only to completely new aircraft type designs. NACA believes it is essential that the standard apply to both in-production aircraft and new type designs, and that the definition of in production be any covered aircraft produced after the compliance deadline. We simply cannot forego the emissions reductions to be garnered from regulating in production engines and find no persuasive reason to forego them. On the issue of timing, NACA recommends that the standard take effect as soon as possible, by 2020 for new aircraft types and by 2023 for in-production aircraft. NACA is still studying the CO2 stringency options identified by EPA and the ANPR. However, we can say now that our association strongly encourages ICAO and EPA to set a standard that is as stringent as possible, and that the standard be technology forcing rather than technology following. NACA would also like to touch briefly on a few additional issues related to an aircraft CO2 emissions standard. First, we recommend that engines associated with, but not part of an aircraft, also be addressed by an aircraft CO2 standard. Key among these are auxiliary power units. Second, we recommend that EPA pursue opportunities for establishing standards for in-use aircraft, which, for example, can be retrofitted with winglets to reduce draft and save fuel. Third, although the standard at issue here is for CO2, there is also the potential for additional NOx emission reductions, and we encourage EPA to analyze this potential carefully and take steps to maximize reductions. Finally, while NACA supports the establishment of an international aircraft CO2 standard through ICAO, a domestic standard that reaps the full measure of potential reductions from this source category is critically important. Therefore, we urge that EPA be prepared to adopt a more rigorous program and standard than ICAO if the international standard falls short, including with respect to the items we have raised in this testimony. In the coming weeks, we will continue to study these and other issues related to EPA's proposed endangerment finding and ANPR, and will offer additional comments in writing by the August 31st deadline. And in the meantime, we appreciate this opportunity to share our views this morning and look forward to continuing to work with you on this important initiative. Thank you.
Thank you all for your thoughtful comments. I appreciate that. Agency appreciates your comments. Let me now call the second group of speakers up, please. Thank you. So in the second group, we have Mr. Eric White from the California Air Resources Board, John DePete from the Airline Pilots Association International, and Mr. James Lee, member of the public. And just for everybody's purpose, into the mic, please, nice and loud, so we can hear. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the proposed endangerment finding and advance notice of proposed rulemaking for greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft. My name is Eric White, and I am Chief of the Mobile Source Control Division at the California Air Resources Board. The Air Resources Board is a California state agency responsible for meeting federal air quality standards and coordinating the state's activities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. ARB will also be providing written comments into the docket. However, I am here today to emphasize the need for strong national greenhouse gas emission standards for aircraft and to reemphasize the unique opportunity that US EPA has to be a global leader for reducing aviation emissions. I'd like to begin by reiterating part of the testimony provided by ARB Chairman Mary Nichols in 2008 at the hearing for regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. At that hearing, Chairman Nichols said, "Climate change is a real and urgent threat to our communities, our state, and our nation. Over the past 100 years, we have experienced a 7-inch sea rise, eroding our coastal communities and threatening critical infrastructure. In the winter, more of our precipitation in California is falling as rain than snow, leading to less water availability in the critical spring and summer, an impact that threatens one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world and a pillar of the nation's export economy. Climate change is also a major factor in our longer and more severe wildfire season. It is predicted that without major efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, in this century, California will see a 1 to 2 foot sea level rise, a 75% loss in snowpack, twice the frequency of drought years, and 55% more large forest fires. Her comments are even truer today than they were 7 years ago, as demonstrated by the severe drought and wildfires that are gripping California even as I speak. The passage of California's Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, established one of the world's most comprehensive and ambitious greenhouse gas reduction programs and positioned California to be on the forefront of addressing climate change emissions. However, in some sectors, such as aviation, California and the various states are dependent on the federal government to set the most aggressive standards feasible. In that vein, the Clean Air Act provides the US EPA with both the authority and the responsibility to do what California and the other states cannot do by themselves. Today, I speak before you to support the endangerment finding that greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft cause or contribute to air pollution that may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. As stated in California's 2007 Joint Petition for Aircraft GHG Emissions Rulemaking and comments on the 2008 Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for Greenhouse Gases under the Clean Air Act, the overwhelming scientific data support the claim that air pollution made up of the elevated atmospheric concentrations of the 6 well-mixed GHGs endanger both the public health and public welfare. Since that time, new scientific assessments have further substantiated the detrimental effect of GHG emissions. As asserted in 2007, the USA has the obligation under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act to set emission standards accordingly once the endangerment finding is made. As the US EPA has noted, aircraft emissions make up the 3rd largest U.S. transportation source of GHGs after emissions from light-duty vehicles and medium and heavy-duty trucks. The aircraft GHG emissions, 11% of the U.S. GHG emissions from transportation, are greater than all other transportation sources combined that come after it, and it remains the single largest unregulated GHG-emitting transportation source in the U.S. Furthermore, it is estimated that U.S. aircraft will exhibit the largest growth in GHG emissions amongst all transportation sector vocations. As such, it is imperative that decisive and expeditious action be carried out to stem GHG emissions from aircraft. ARB recognizes that the International Civil Aviation Organization is anticipated to promulgate a CO2 aircraft emission standard. While this is a promising initial step in controlling GHG emissions from aircraft, historically, ICAO emission standards have been technology following, not technology forcing. As such, ARB is concerned that the standards eventually adopted by ICAO may not sufficiently reduce GHG emissions past a business-as-usual scenario. ARB supports the international establishment of aircraft emission standards that are as stringent as possible, and in the absence of a strong showing by ICAO, we urge the U.S. EPA to extend its regulatory authority further and adopt a CO2 emission standard that will forward technology development and provide accelerated reductions. There are a variety of both aircraft design and aircraft engine technologies under development which show tremendous promise in furthering national and California GHG emission reduction goals, and these should be considered as part of this regulation. ARB recommends the U.S. EPA also look at the use of biojet fuel as a method to reduce GHG emissions. From a wells-to-wheel basis, the use of these fuels can have a substantial impact on reducing GHG emissions from aviation. Going beyond the business as usual also means that standards must be adopted that are applicable both to aircraft models that are in production after the effective date of the standard, as well as to future aircraft types. ARB also supports an additional reporting requirement for aircraft crews' CO2 emission rates due to the importance of collecting data to ascertain regulatory compliance, as well as to inform policy decisions on future CO2 emissions reduction opportunities. The reporting requirement could be standalone or in conjunction with an emission standard for both new and in-production aircraft types. Further, as a complement to the CO2 emission standard, ARB encourages U.S. EPA to seek additional aircraft-related reduction opportunities. These include retrofit requirements for existing in-use aircraft with fuel-efficient technologies and reducing emissions from auxiliary power units on aircraft. ARB also encourages U.S. EPA to consider regulations to further reduce aircraft engine criteria pollutants, particularly oxides of nitrogen. The mitigation of aircraft-related emissions remains a critical part of ARB's emission reduction strategies, and ARB is working to do its part by ensuring other aviation-related emission reduction opportunities, pursuing other aviation-related emission opportunities. For instance, in the near term, ARB will consider measures to reduce emissions from ground support equipment, airport shuttle buses, and other on-facility airport-related emissions. In closing, in the event that ICAO fails to adopt a meaningful aircraft CO2 emission standard by next February, standards that go far beyond business as usual, ARB urges U.S. EPA to act independently of ICAO and establish a strong national CO2 emission standard without further delay. California believes it is clear that U.S. EPA has authority to impose more stringent regulations than ICAO on U.S. aircraft and engine manufacturers, and we believe the overwhelming scientific data has proven that aircraft GHG emissions do endanger public health. Therefore, U.S. EPA has the obligation, under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act, to set emission standards as expeditiously as possible. Decisive and timely regulation of major GHG sources is critical to meet our state and national GHG goals. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. DePete, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present this important public hearing. I'm Captain Joe DePete. I serve as the first Vice President of the Airline Pilots Association International, and I serve also as a National Safety Coordinator. I'm also a FedEx pilot and a captain that flies the A300, the Airbus A300. ALPA is the world's largest professional airline pilots union. We have more than 52,000 members who fly for 31 airlines in the United States and Canada. I'd like to give ALPA's view on the EPA's proposed finding regarding greenhouse gas emissions and its advanced notice of public rulemaking. But first, however, I'd like to provide some context about why we're passionate about this subject. I'll also talk about the positive difference that U.S. airlines are making to reduce emissions while safely transporting more than 2 million passengers and more than 63,000 tons of freight and mail each day. Airline pilots literally sit at the intersection of technology. Aircraft operating procedures, aircraft traffic control procedures and techniques, and varying aircraft capabilities. This gives us a unique vantage point from which to manage our aircraft capabilities in such a way as to burn less fuel while operating as safely and efficiently as possible. ALPA's principal goal is to help further the advances that aviation has already made towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving the efficiency of our industry while maintaining or improving on our current level of safety. Improved engine and aircraft technologies have resulted in significant reductions in harmful emissions. Increased reliance on satellite-based navigation will lead to even more significant reductions. In addition, these improvements contribute to the need to ensure ongoing viability and sustainability of the airline industry. Fuel is the largest single expense that our airline employers face. In addition to the need to act responsibly toward the environment, airlines have a very strong motivation to safely find ways to use as little fuel as possible and look for alternative fuels that are not only less expensive, but also have less effect on our environment. The simple fact is that whatever affects our employers ultimately affects pilots as well. We have a similar financial incentive to help them conserve fuel. Pilots work with their companies in air traffic control on a daily basis to safely reduce fuel burn while airborne and on the ground. Additionally, our membership is cognizant of the need to protect our environment, just like the airlines. We strive to do that on every flight within the bounds of safety, which is, of course, our primary focus. ALPA strongly supports reducing aviation's already small percentage of contributions to greenhouse gases, while at the same time preserving the economic viability of the airline industry. These two goals are complementary. As fuel and operational efficiency continue to improve, economic viability is enhanced. Air transportation is a significant portion of the mass transportation system here in North America. U.S. airlines transport about 775 million passengers and carry about 23 million tons of freight and mail each year. Aviation arguably has the most successful record of any sector in the economy in limiting its impact on the environment, while simultaneously increasing productivity. Airlines have greatly reduced carbon-based emissions through ever-advancing engine technology that reduces fuel burn and emissions of undesirable gases and particulates. We also use airframes that are lighter, stronger, and create less fuel-burning drag. Now, compared to 1972, the North American airline industry now carries 6 times more payload using 60% less fuel per flight. I think that's a significant number. It has reduced by 95% the number of people significantly impacted by aircraft noise. Because of these advances, airline domestic travel accounts for only 2% of all greenhouse gas emissions, while accounting for about 5% of the gross national product. The bottom line for ALPA is that we are strong advocates for staying the course when it comes to improving fuel efficiency through new technology. Airlines must be able to afford to invest in new, more efficient aircraft and engines that reduce the impact on the environment, which has been the key to their success. Concerning the EPA's announcement, we're pleased that the agency is working with the ICAO Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection and is engaged in developing a future aircraft certification standard for CO2, carbon dioxide. We urge the agency not to exceed that standard, which is slated to be considered for approval in February of 2016. As the EPA knows, ICAO is in a unique position to bring together governments and world airlines to collaborate and develop a standard that will be adopted by member states, including the United States and Canada. Going beyond these agreed upon standards could have a very detrimental effect on our airlines. ALPA is a strong proponent of a level playing field for all airlines. The creation of a U.S.-specific emission standard that is more stringent than that used by other ICAO nations would put our carriers at a distinct financial disadvantage without a commensurate benefit to the environment. Regarding the advanced NPRM, ALPA does not believe that any new emission standards requirement for aircraft should involve retrofitting of in-service aircraft or aircraft already on order. The standard should apply only to new types of aircraft that are yet to be certified so as not to cause an undue financial harm to the airline industry. I wish to thank you all again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'd be pleased to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Mr. Lee.
Hi, my name is James Lee. I'm from Sumter, South Carolina. I'm a citizen. Why is the EPA claiming that 6 greenhouse gases emitted from jet planes are a threat to human health under the Clean Air Act while doing nothing to address ongoing lawsuits over leaded aviation gasoline or the real health concerns of stakeholders worldwide? Cancer-causing heavy metals in fuels and their additives, and aviation-induced cloudiness. You, the EPA, claim the authority to regulate aviation emissions under the Clean Air Act, a law that should protect us from the aforementioned poisonous pollution. However, the definition of pollution is being perverted to mean climate change gases in what can only be called a violation of the spirit of the law. Air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. That's the quote. As you can see by the wording in the Clean Air Act, lead, barium, aluminum, and trade secret toxic chemicals clearly present a greater danger to public health than greenhouse gases, no matter how much climate science you accumulate. Furthermore, material safety data sheets of aviation fuel and their additives almost always contain the same warning: do not dump in water. Yet, raw fuel dumping or burning these dangerous chemicals and then dumping them in water is somehow safe. Finally, despite great efforts to find bioaccumulation or biomagnification studies on precipitated aviation pollutants, none seem to exist. The EPA and Obama administration are ignoring the global outrage over the most visible climate change concern from airplanes: cloud creation. Do a search for the word chemtrails on the internet, and you will see millions of concerned citizens who look up and wonder what in the world are they spraying. Despite what you may think of the myriad of maladies attributed to these clouds, the global outrage is nonetheless clear. They are right to be worried, and we should all be concerned. The EPA's claim that CO2 is a greater threat to human health than contrails and aviation-induced cloudiness is based on incomplete IPCC data that downplays the effects of contrails on our climate. The IPCC's fourth assessment of contrail radiative forcing only accounted for linear contrails, meaning any contrail that spreads out and turns into cirrus clouds was not accounted for. How significant is this heat-trapping contrail conundrum? Quote, contrails formed by aircraft can evolve into cirrus clouds indistinguishable from those formed naturally. These spreading contrails may be causing more climate warming today than all the carbon dioxide emitted by aircraft since the start of aviation. Another researcher stated a single aircraft operating in conditions favorable for persistent contrail formation appears to exert a contrail-induced radiative forcing some 5,000 times greater than the estimates of the average persistent contrail radiative forcing from the entire civil aviation fleet. Why did I lose my place? Although this research has now been incorporated into the IPCC computer models and revised down, in my opinion, these claims highlight gaping holes in climate science. As of 2013, quote, aerosol cloud interactions are one of the main uncertainties in climate research. Scientific understanding of how contrails transition into cirrus clouds is severely lacking but rapidly evolving, with the latest research showing that cirrus clouds are filled with metal aerosols from human sources. Quote, the big one we found is lead, coming from things like tetraethyl lead in fuels still used today in light aviation. So that's probably the biggest metal that we find, or the most frequent metal that we find, but we find a whole host of different metals actually. Apparently, small amounts of metal particulates have major effects on cirrus clouds. Quote, it would seem that you would have to change all of the aerosol in the atmosphere very radically to get a big effect on the clouds, but because mineral dust and metallic particles are such a small amount of the particulate matter, just 1% or 2%, it means that you only have to change about 1% or 2% of the particles to get a big effect on these clouds. The latest research casts doubts on the IPCC's contrail assumptions and requires serious consideration when addressing the real climate change impact of aviation. High-altitude metals and cirrus cloud condensation nuclei are likely coming from leaded avgas and jet exhaust. Contrails are making cirrus clouds, and small changes in atmospheric metal have large impacts on cirrus cloud creation. Cirrus clouds trap heat and are likely to have a greater climate change impact than CO2. Finally, aviation-induced cloudiness endangers future growth in solar energy, affects tourism and spending, and is projected to make terrestrial astronomy impossible by 2050. Geoengineering scientists, NASA, NOAA, FAA, USDA, DOE, and international corporate partners are discussing the use of biofuels and sulfur-doped jet fuels for contrail control. This cirrus cloud seeding with bismuth triiodide to melt these clouds away. The EPA should be directly involved in these discussions. As a result of these recent findings, I strongly encourage the EPA to consider expanding the scope of this endangerment to include metal particulates and cloud formation from jet exhaust. If the EPA complies with the spirit of the Clean Air Act, they will protect us from metal aerosols attributed to Alzheimer's, autism, cancer, and a plethora of other debilitating illnesses. If the EPA is truly concerned about aviation-induced climate change, they will regulate the production of contrails and cirrus clouds, which change our climate to a much greater extent than the sum of the 6 greenhouse gases named in this proposal. Regulating heavy metals and aviation-induced cloudiness will be meaningless without proper verification. Even though ICAO members sign a binding agreement to only use certain chemicals in their gas tanks, we all know agreements and regulations are useless without proper verification. Therefore, I request mandatory, random testing of jet exhaust be immediately implemented. This is the most important step the EPA can take to do its due diligence to protect us from harmful pollution and get real-world data to improve future regulations. Most of the data behind this endangerment finding comes from research in highly controlled environments where most variables are known. We need verification of non-ideal situations where fuel fouling, fame contamination, or improper maintenance end in vastly different exhaust particulates than seen in lab settings. To achieve verification, I propose that the EPA randomly attach a trailing probe to both foreign and domestic flights, then collect and analyze the results to determine real-world exhaust constituents. Alternatively, ground-based LiDAR observations may be possible over fixed high-traffic areas and prevent possible terrorist attacks using aerosols. Either way you choose, we need verification and protection. In conclusion, the EPA should expand this endangerment to include metal aerosols and cloud creation, create a verification system that includes all aircraft, protects us from aviation pollution, holds violators accountable, and commits to better scientific accuracy for future determinations. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of so many who could not be here. And thank you for listening to a layperson's views on this subject. While I appreciate the efforts of the Center for Biological Diversity, the Sierra Group, and the Friends of the Earth to get the EPA to hold the aviation industry accountable, the poor people like myself have to live near these airports, under these fuel dumps, and under these clouded skies. I hope that some faith can be restored in our EPA by your action here and now. Tell the ICAO that they will meet your demands and our demands, not the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Thank you for all of your comments. Second panel. Next one.
Yes, thank you all. I think we're okay. Set. And then I'm going to call forward the group number 3 panel at this point. So this would be, and I apologize if I don't pronounce anyone's name properly, Leslie Regal, Doug Wolf, and Michael Saracino.
Leslie Riegel, Director of Environmental Policy at the Aerospace Industries Association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on EPA's proposed endangerment finding and advanced notice of proposed rulemaking on aircraft greenhouse gas emissions. AIA is the largest aerospace trade association representing the nation's major aerospace and defense manufacturers. We represent more than 300 U.S. manufacturing companies with nearly 1 million skilled employees. Our members are recognized across the globe for manufacturing reliable, uncompromisingly safe aircraft that connect passengers and cargo and help defend our national security. Our industry is heavily regulated and must pass grueling safety and airworthiness criteria on any new aircraft or changes to existing aircraft. We never compromise on safety. Aviation is a global industry and works under the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which has been setting global aviation standards for environment and safety for over 50 years. This globally harmonized model has worked well for the United States. The U.S. aviation industry has thrived on this global playing field, as evidenced by the positive impact that we play on our national's trade balance, and we hope to continue to build on this model as we develop new fuel efficiency standards for aircraft. The commercial aviation industry has a strong environmental track record, including steady technology improvements in reducing aircraft carbon dioxide emissions over time. Today's commercial aircraft are 70% more fuel efficient than aircraft flying 50 years ago. Greater fuel efficiency translates into reductions in aircraft fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. The commercial aviation industry has achieved greater fuel efficiency and lower emissions even as it has grown. Today, more than 3% of global gross domestic product is supported by aviation, yet only 2% of global CO2 emissions are attributable to aviation. It is for this reason that the commercial aviation industry is committed to building upon its strong environmental track record. The industry understands that climate change is a serious global environmental challenge requiring credible action. In 2008, the industry agreed to a set of environmental targets to combat carbon emissions. They include improving fuel efficiency by an average of 1.5% per year from 2009 to 2020, stabilizing emissions from 2020 with carbon neutral growth, and reducing net carbon emissions from aviation by 50% by 2050 compared to 2005 levels. The industry will meet these goals through improved aircraft fuel efficiency, such as the introduction of new aircraft models with the latest fuel-saving technologies and advanced propulsion systems, operational efficiencies, air traffic management system modernization and improvements such as NextGen, and greater use of sustainable aviation biofuels. In addition, our industry, by way of competition and regulation, must make certain that in achieving our CO2 reduction goals, we address other environmental considerations such as particulate matter and NOx, as well as noise. ICAO is the only international body in which aviation-specific technological feasibility, economic viability, and environmental benefit can be evaluated together in shaping policy. It takes a comprehensive approach to respond to the environmental challenges facing the commercial aviation industry, including aircraft CO2 emission standards. These interdependencies are critical to consider when any new regulation is proposed and incorporated into domestic law. The U.S. has agreed, as one of the 190 parties to the Chicago Convention, that ICAO has the authority to establish environmental standards for aircraft. EPA's practice has been to adopt ICAO standards as its own for new commercial aircraft engines. The Federal Aviation Administration, with support from the EPA and other federal agencies, has followed a similar approach in setting aircraft noise standards. We see no reason for the EPA to deviate from this well-established practice in addressing aircraft CO2 emission standards. The Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, CAPE, is expected to adopt a final aircraft CO2 emission standard in February 2016 with full ratification by the ICAO Assembly in September of 2016. This recommendation will be a result of years of data input, analyses, and careful consideration. Our members, along with aviation colleagues, government officials, and NGOs, have been working at ICAO on a CO2 standard for civil aircraft for over 6 years to ensure that this is done in the most educated and effective manner. As it has in the past, EPA should follow this well-established path and adopt the ICAO standards into U.S. domestic law under Section 231. Doing so will ensure that the U.S. aircraft and engine manufacturers are not placed at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis international competitors. Moreover, it will avoid the attendant disruptions to air travel from the U.S. having to enforce an aircraft CO2 emission standards that is different from that adopted by other countries. Again, on behalf of AIA and its members, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. AIA will also be submitting comments to the docket relating to this rulemaking.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having this important hearing. My name is Michael Saraceno. I'm a citizen. While greenhouse gas emissions from aviation may be only 2 to 2.5%, the global aviation CO2 emission almost equals the amount of CO2 put out by the country of Germany. Others have talked about how CO2 is trapped in the atmosphere and causes warming of the earth, so I will leave more of that to them. But the fact is that the more CO2 that is put into the atmosphere, that results in more combustion. And I think one of the biggest concerns with more combustion from aviation and the sure increase in aviation, the FAA forecasts that aviation will grow 2% per year, reaching 1 billion passengers by 2029. And the issue with more combustion not only is more CO2, but the FAA Modernization Act that was recently passed in 2012 essentially is allowing the FAA, through precision-based navigation, to save. Yes, they do save fuel on descent because they're not doing step down. But what they're not telling you is the FAA is allowing the airlines to crop dust USA, okay? And the reason how they're doing this is through next-gen or precision-based navigation. They're allowing the airlines to pack in more planes in tidal formation at much lower altitudes. And we know from NASA that aircraft operations below 3,000 feet decrease ground-level air quality. Okay, and that's NASA saying that, and I'm submitting my testimony into the docket as well with all the references, so you can feel free to look them up yourself. So we have all around this country the FAA allowing, right, they changed the highways in the sky across USA, and they have not found one environmental impact. That's it. You can change the highway over the entire continental U.S., and there's not one environmental impact that will impose on anyone or any person. That is absolutely ridiculous. But the most important issue, the reason why this needs to be investigated further, is that the more combustion that we have, the more landings and takeoffs year over year impacts the people who live downwind from airports across the United States. Now, what's the difference, right, from living downwind from a highway, from living downwind to the airport? But certainly, both of those situations will give you downwind pollution. And the difference is that highways have noise barriers or pollution barriers, and NOAA has done studies on this, that those sound barriers with vegetation prevent highway pollution from floating downwind into communities, okay? Where is the barriers to downwind pollution from aviation? And most of that is through approaches. I've listed several studies that have done London Heathrow, LaGuardia, a bunch of different studies that have shown that, in fact, airport particulates can reach as far as 5 to 6, in some cases 10 nautical miles downwind from an airport. Okay? And so the biggest issue with that is that we know that vaccines do not cause autism. Okay? The largest organization in February 2012 came out and said that vaccines do not cause autism. And why did they say that? Because every scientific journal that was published on that refuted that. And in fact, it proved the opposite of that. We now have 12 peer-reviewed studies, and I've cited in my references, that there's an increased risk of autism associated with increased air pollution around conception and or pregnancy. The vast majority, and I talked to Harvard scientists through personal communication, is not genetic. It's environmentally induced pollution. And environmentally induced pollution is what is causing autism. And we will see a spike in autism across the USA, and I don't care, they can change the diagnosis or hide the incidence. But the fact of the matter is more children are receiving services today than they were, and they will continue to receive more services over the next 10 years. There is a heavy metal load in autism. We know that. That's why vaccines were pointed at. The heavy metal load in in air pollution can in fact deposit in the hair and nails of these children. And in fact, when they do look back at the hair and nails of these children, they find that the heavy metal deposition in the hair and nails is significantly higher than typically developing children. So we know they're being exposed to toxic metals, and that's from environmental pollution. UC Davis 2012 just came out with a new study that said the 2015 cost of autism-related expenses are $268 billion. And by the year 2025, it could be anywhere between $500 to $1 trillion in related costs. We know that aviation emissions have trace heavy metals. They have the byproduct is NOx. It is sulfur. The aviation jet fuel contains 100 times more sulfur than diesel trucks. And we can talk about autism, but also high air pollution areas also decrease IQ of children. And the very interesting thing about that is that even when these children hit 6, 7 years old, they still did not catch up to their peers. So this damage that's being caused by low IQ, by pollution-induced, and it does have effect on one of the most important things that I will tell you. If you want to know how dangerous air pollution is, you just have to look at the transgenerational epigenetic changes. So there was a study done in that I have in the reference by, let's see here, where is it, by Tracy in 2013. And so what they did is they exposed mice to jet fuel, and what they found is that it didn't change the gene, but it changed the way the gene was expressed. And that change in the way the gene is expressed for obesity got into the genome and was passed on to subsequent generations. Okay, and so this is why I care, because my nieces and nephews, my children, could potentially marry somebody else's kids who are in a heavily polluted environment, and that change in the genome gets into the gene pool. So your grandchildren and great-grandchildren could in fact develop transgenerational epigenetic changes through environmental pollution. And another way, besides greenhouse gases, and I'll keep this brief, there is evidence to show that persistent contrails do in fact warm the Earth. They trap incoming solar radiation and they block outgoing infrared radiation. And so there were studies done by NASA, and what they found is after the 9/11 attacks, there was a 1 degree Celsius spike between the maximum highs and the maximum lows in terms of temperature. So they looked at skies without contrails after 9/11 because the planes were grounded for 3 days, and they found a spike in the temperature range. So in fact, contrails do change the climate. And I'll just end with another NASA scientist also talked about contrails, and he's using data from, I think, the 1990s to 2000s, early 2000s. So this is old data, but what he says is that increase in surface and lower atmosphere's temperatures by 0.36 or 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So that's what he's saying the contribution to contrails could be to warming, 0.36 to 0.54% Fahrenheit per decade. And I think that proves that contrails do in fact affect temperature. And the other thing you should know about persistent contrails, is we have more combustion, more jet aircraft, more airplanes, you're going to get more contrails, and you're going to get more warming. So it's this whole vicious cycle. And the thing about contrails is that they produce clouds that morph into cirrus, okay? When they study contrail spreading, they only study within the first few hours. They do not study the whole life of that artificial cloud that's produced. And that artificial cloud that is produced would not have formed if there would not have been a contrail in that area. So these clouds that are being induced are producing clouds that would not naturally be there. That changes the hydrological cycle, which is rain. And the other thing that you should know is that the way it could change the rain is that when the engine at high altitude freezes the ice crystals in the atmosphere, it is actually changing the vapor content in the atmosphere. Okay, so that vapor content will have a change on regional climate change. And I thank you very much for having this open hearing.
My name is Doug Wolf. I'm representing the Center for Biological Diversity. Thank you for convening this hearing and for soliciting further public input concerning the agency's crucial effort to promulgate greenhouse gas emission standards for aircraft. The Center for Biological Diversity appreciates the opportunity to comment. The Center for Biological Diversity is a nonprofit organization with more than 800,000 members and online activists. The Center's Climate Law Institute seeks to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollution to protect biological diversity, the environment and human health and welfare. Specific objectives include securing protections for species threatened by global warming, ensuring compliance with applicable laws to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollution, and educating and mobilizing the public on global warming and air quality issues. Climate change is already upon us, with unprecedented temperature increases, rising sea levels, extraordinary rates of species extinction, and more extreme weather events. Efforts to quickly and sharply curb and then eliminate carbon pollution are essential if we are to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Science tells us that this requires the U.S. to reduce emissions in the range of 35% to 65% by 2030 from 1990 baseline levels. To begin to approach those levels, every significant carbon emission source must reduce its emissions, and the aircraft industry has too long evaded every attempt to make it contribute its fair share. In fact, if global aircraft CO2 emissions were compared to those of countries, they would rank 7th, just behind Germany, outranking about 150 other countries in the world. Aviation emissions are growing rapidly and could triple within just a few decades. Unless EPA puts in place stringent standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increased aviation traffic will cause the sector to become one of the fastest growing sources of harmful emissions. And within the global community, the United States is by far the largest emitter of aircraft carbon pollution, with its domestic and international flights contributing 29% of the total, dumping that amount into the global skies absolutely unchecked. In other words, U.S. aviation emissions harm the global community in a hugely disproportionate fashion. The U.S. must reverse this situation and cut emissions quickly and steeply, and must reject the patently insufficient measures proposed by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. We fully agree with EPA's finding that aircraft carbon emissions endanger human health and welfare. We believe, however, that this proposed finding was much too late in coming, and we urge the agency to make up for lost time by finalizing it forthwith and no later than November 2015. 3 months after the close of the current comment period. We also urge EPA to follow up its ANPR with proposed standards at the same time it finalizes its endangerment finding. There is no reason to wait the outcome of negotiations at ICAO, as even the most stringent measures under consideration there would hardly make a dent in the problem. In fact, under the likely outcome of the international negotiations, in 2030, only 5% of the global aircraft fleet would even be regulated, and this by a standard based on technology in existence in 2016, or some 14 years behind 2030 technology. Moreover, the ICAO proposals set no cap on emissions. In other words, ICAO's proposals do next to nothing to affect business as usual, an outcome utterly incompatible with EPA's duties under the Clean Air Act, the President's Climate Action Plan, and the demands of climate science. EPA should seize the opportunity to issue proposed emission standards in time to make a difference at the Paris climate negotiations in December of this year. We are pleased to see EPA's acknowledgement that the Clean Air Act authorizes it to regulate not just aircraft engines, but the entire aircraft. We add that the Act's delegation of authority to EPA under Section 231 is extraordinarily broad, and that EPA is explicitly authorized to set emission standards for all classes of aircraft. Moreover, as EPA recognized in its 2008 ANPR, EPA's regulations can encompass aircraft operations and air traffic management. Finally, the standards EPA settles on should be technology forcing, not following. With these premises in mind, EPA should set emission standards not just for new types of aircraft, but also for all aircraft currently in production and in service, should base them on currently existing as well as under development technology, and should include operational and air traffic management requirements that reduce emissions. Aircraft failing to retrofit to meet achievable standards should be phased out. We urge EPA to craft these standards by employing an approach similar to standards for vehicles, setting fleet-wide averages for new and in-service aircraft. These standards should be sufficiently stringent, not only to hold total emissions at a set cap, but to actually reduce them for the entire U.S. aviation sector within the coming decade. The Center will be submitting written comments at the close of the comment period. We're working with other organizations. We thank you for this opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all speakers. Appreciate your comments and thoughts. I will now move to the next group of speakers. After I call your name, please come up to the table. We have Kathy Kinsey from the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, Sue Valdez, a member of the public, and Andres Restrepo from the Sierra Club. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Kathy Kinsey. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. Would like to thank you today for the opportunity to be here to testify on EPA's proposed endangerment finding and on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. NESCOM is an organization of 8 states, the 6 Northeast states, and New York and New Jersey. And my testimony today here reflects the majority view of our states and does not necessarily reflect the views of all of our individual state members. So NESCOM supports EPA's proposed finding under the Clean Air Act Section 231 that aircraft greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health and welfare. This support is consistent with the support, our support in 2009 for EPA's proposed or endangerment finding for mobile sources. Since the 2009 rulemaking, climate science has only grown stronger. The latest science is summarized in the 2014 International Panel on Climate Change, establishes that climate-related threats are already affecting our states, our nation, and the world. NESCOM also supports EPA's determination that aircraft emissions from certain classes of aircraft are contributing to the mix of greenhouse gases that are subject to this rulemaking. We support the development and adoption of aircraft greenhouse gas emission standards for U.S. aircraft. In this regard, we support a whole aircraft approach to adopting standards that doesn't focus solely on the engine. A whole aircraft approach recognizes that emissions are influenced by aircraft weight, aerodynamics, and the engine-specific fuel consumption. We urge EPA to adopt greenhouse gas standards for new aircraft and in-production aircraft. That approach will begin to materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the next 5 to 10 years from the projected business-as-usual levels. And it should be based on a reference scenario that reflects current aircraft performance. A reference scenario that is based on outdated aircraft performance will only lead to inflated estimates of greenhouse gas emission reductions from current reductions. And finally, NESCOM urges EPA to take the opportunity with this rulemaking to revise the current aircraft NOx emission standards. Given the continuing ozone attainment problems in our region, the Northeast region, and the nation as a whole, and the fact that under its current process, ICAO is unlikely to adopt new aircraft NOx standards prior to 2022, if then, EPA should take the opportunity to act now and establish a production cutoff date of December 31st, 2018 for the United States, after which Tier 8 NOx standards will apply to newly manufactured aircraft in lieu of the Tier 6 standards. NESCOM intends to submit more detailed written comments before the close of the record, and again, we thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. My name is Andres Restrepo, and I'm an associate attorney with Sierra Club's environmental law program. Sierra Club was founded in 1892 and stands today as one of the largest and most active grassroots environmental organizations in the United States. With over 2.4 million members and supporters, as well as 64 affiliated chapters nationwide, the club works to secure a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable environment for today's world and for future generations alike. One of the club's most urgent goals is working to curb the effects of climate change, and we strongly advocate for steep and immediate cuts to greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of the economy. Unless governments act now, we will be unable to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, which include rising sea levels, more extreme temperatures and weather events, mass displacement of peoples, more severe droughts and floods, enhanced formation of harmful air pollution, and widespread extinctions of plant and animal species. The Sierra Club strongly supports federal greenhouse gas regulations for aircraft to help mitigate the harms posed by climate change. For far too long, U.S. aircraft have been emitting unlimited amounts of these pollutants into the atmosphere. Domestic and international U.S. flights now contribute nearly 30% of the world's CO2 emissions from aircraft, far more than any other country. In fact, U.S. aircraft emit more greenhouse gases than the entire economies of all but 8 countries, with none with a population below 80 million. Furthermore, these emissions will increase by as much as 50% over the next 2 decades unless mandatory restraints are imposed. EPA's finding that greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft endanger public health and welfare is, therefore, entirely sound. The effects of climate change, as well as the climate-disrupting effect of greenhouse gas emissions, are so well documented that they require no additional discussion here. Under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act, an endangerment finding triggers the agency's obligation to issue binding aircraft regulations. Given the size and scope of this problem, EPA must not delay the regulatory process in any way. In particular, the agency must forge ahead with these regulations without awaiting the greenhouse gas standards forthcoming from the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. The most stringent proposal currently under consideration by that body would cover only 5% of global aircraft, would rely on 2016 technology for aircraft built in 2030, and would not impose a total cap on emissions from the global fleet. Accordingly, Even under a best-case scenario, the ICAO standards will do little, if anything, to curb the intensifying problem of aircraft emissions. The United States must exhibit leadership on this issue, and EPA should move forward with strong, effective standards under Section 231. To that end, EPA must adhere to several principles. First, the agency must cover all aircraft under any final standard. This requires regulation not only of new designs and/or newly constructed aircraft, but of aircraft currently in use as well. EPA is certainly correct to assert the authority to regulate emissions from entire aircraft rather than simply from emissions or from engines, and may address all categories of aircraft in its regulations. Notably, Section 231's broad mandate does not constrain the agency's authority to regulate existing aircraft in any way, and EPA must take advantage of this aspect of the statute if it expects to achieve meaningful reductions from the U.S. fleet. Second, in keeping with the spirit and purpose of the Clean Air Act, but in marked contrast to ICAO's efforts, EPA's standard must be technology forcing rather than technology following. The language of the statute makes clear that Congress intended for Section 231 standards not merely to reflect what aircraft are capable of achieving at a given point in time, but to enhance those capabilities above what they would have been otherwise. Hence, Section 231 provides that regulations shall take effect on a time frame that would permit the development and application of the requisite technology. EPA must therefore base its forthcoming standards not only on existing technology, but on in-development technology as well. Next, EPA should consider a fleet-wide averaging program, also permitted under Section 231. A regulation of this nature would allow the agency to achieve the greatest emission reductions at the lowest cost. The agency should also address operational and air traffic management practices in its final rule, which could provide emission reduction opportunities at very low cost. Finally, EPA must require any aircraft that cannot be designed to meet the requisite final standard or cannot be retrofitted to achieve it to phase out and ultimately retire. It is critical that EPA prohibit old and outdated aircraft from continuing to pollute our skies and contribute to climate change while better, more efficient designs are readily available. Sierra Club appreciates EPA's efforts to move forward with greenhouse gas regulations for aircraft, and we urge the agency to promulgate a standard that is strong, effective, and technology forcing. While EPA must take the time necessary to develop an appropriate and well-considered final rule, time is particularly of the essence. In December, President Obama and administration officials will travel to Paris to negotiate an international climate accord with leaders from around the world. The stronger our commitments to reduce greenhouse gases domestically, the more effective our negotiating position will be vis-à-vis other countries. We therefore strongly encourage EPA to move swiftly ahead with these regulations to help achieve the best possible outcome this fall in Paris. I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this issue and look forward to submitting comments on behalf of Sierra Club on the agency's proposal in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you both for your comments and thoughts. Before I turn it to Bill to introduce the next group, I want to make one last call. Is Sue Valdez here? No. Okay, thank you both.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to group number 5. So could we please hear from Kate DeAngelis, Amanda Bass, and David Baki. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. My name is Kate DeAngelis, and I am a climate and energy campaigner at Friends of the Earth. Research has shown that we must keep 80% of the world's fossil fuel reserves in the ground to have a good chance of avoiding the worst impacts of climate disruption. As the world's largest historical emitter, the United States must shoulder the greatest share of the burden for making emission reductions. In order to achieve the necessary emission reductions to avert catastrophic climate disruption, the United States must take significant strides to reduce carbon pollution from every sector of the economy, including aircraft. The EPA has already taken action to reduce emissions from cars, trucks, and power plants. Now the EPA needs to show the same leadership and limit aircraft carbon dioxide emissions. Globally, airline operations produced 705 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2013. To put that in perspective, the global aviation emissions industry would rank 7th if included in country emission rankings, just after Germany's total country emissions. This sector is too big to leave unregulated, so the EPA must take immediate action to reduce carbon pollution from aviation. Greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft are currently responsible for more than 3% of the total United States emissions. While this may not seem significant, emissions from the aviation sector are one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gases in the world. They are also the largest emission source that is unregulated in the United States. Without regulation to limit the emissions, carbon pollution from this sector is expected to triple by 2050. Regulation is especially important because of the potentially disproportionate climate impact of high-altitude aircraft emissions. When emissions are higher in the atmosphere, they can have greater warming impact than at ground level. The United States must take the lead in reducing emissions from our aircraft, since we account for a large proportion of the world's aviation emissions. The United States' domestic flights account for 24% of the world's commercial aircraft carbon dioxide emissions and 35% of carbon dioxide emissions from international commercial flights. When the EPA first began analyzing measures to reduce carbon dioxide from aviation in 2008, it estimated greenhouse gas reductions available from engine and airframe changes alone at 13.3%. Despite this, research shows that from 2012 to 2013, United States airlines overall did not make any net fuel efficiency gains. Yet there are plenty of improvements that could be made, as evidenced by the fact that there is a gap of 27% from the most to least fuel-efficient domestic airline. This demonstrates that the industry is already implementing retrofits that are effectively reducing carbon dioxide emissions. EPA regulations would force all airlines to adopt similar measures. The EPA has the legal authority under Section 231 of the Clean Air Act to address emissions from aircraft. This authority to act is broad. The Clean Air Act requires that EPA put forward emission standards for pollution from any class or classes of aircraft engines that it determines may endanger public health. The only substantive restriction that the law places on this authority is that any rules cannot significantly increase noise or hinder safety. The EPA first set pollution standards for future and existing engines in 1973, but these standards did not address carbon pollution. At the time these standards were introduced, the understanding of the impacts and urgency of climate change was minimal. Since then, the scientific evidence for the need to address this pollution has become irrefutable. The EPA must take this opportunity to put forward new rules that reflect the need to take fast and meaningful action to reduce our global warming-inducing emissions. The United States cannot wait for the International Civil Aviation Organization to take action. So far, ICAO has only succeeded in delaying action and has failed to set any climate policies. ICAO was finally expected to put forward some standards in early 2016, but they are likely to be incredibly weak and insufficient, in part because they will not apply to in-use aircraft. The EPA has the legal authority, and the emission reduction potential exists to make far greater reductions than ICAO is expected to mandate. The EPA should adopt its proposed finding that aircraft emissions endanger public health within no more than 3 months of the close of the comment period. In addition, EPA must adopt regulations that are broad in scope. Rather than focusing only on new aircraft engines, any rules that EPA puts forward should include existing aircraft and not limit coverage to just engines, but the entire aircraft. EPA should use its authority to set emission standards for all classes of aircraft in a way that is technology forcing to ensure the greatest emission reductions possible. EPA should follow the example it has set for passenger and medium heavy-duty vehicles and establish fleet-wide averages for new and existing aircraft, including those in service. These standards must be sufficiently stringent to significantly reduce them for the entire United States aviation sector over time. Furthermore, the EPA should work with the Federal Aviation Administration to develop complementary standards to promote the use of low-carbon jet fuels. Thank you for taking the time to consider my comments.
Good morning. My name is Amanda Bays, and I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. For the past 5 years, I have documented aircraft emitting trails across the sky. I have taken hundreds of videos and thousands of photographs of these persisting emissions. Many of the aircraft I have witnessed appear to be spraying something into the atmosphere. Uneasy with my observations, I wanted to know exactly what was causing the aircraft to leave visible trails that did not dissipate. I reached out to local, state, and federal government agencies for information and assistance. What I experienced was disillusioning, to say the least. When I called the EPA, I was told that the FAA handled aircraft emissions, When I called the FAA, they told me to call the EPA. I was shuttled from office to office with no agency ever accepting responsibility or accountability. My calls were not returned, nor were my concerns ever addressed. The sage advice I finally received from the EPA was to hire a plane and do my own testing. This was especially disheartening since I had been led to believe that the Environmental Protection Agency was the ultimate protector of the environment. Additionally, the EPA advised me to contact the Department of Environmental Quality for the state of Virginia. Not surprisingly, the DEQ informed me that they do not regulate mobile sources of emissions, don't go to airports, and don't check what is being loaded on planes. As for my request for my yard to be tested for heavy metal, chemical, or biological contamination, I was told that the Virginia DEQ could not use state money to test for those materials. Furthermore, my complaint was in an area that they had no authority to investigate, another dead end. I reported Naval Air Station Oceana military jets for dumping fuel over my neighborhood and spoke with at least 30 individuals at the base. I finally spoke with Terry Chamberlain, head of the environmental office at Oceana. Mr. Chamberlain bluntly informed me that the military regulates itself. Needless to say, they continue to dump unburnt fuel over the residents living close to the base. For several years, I electronically reported on airplane pollution using the Environmental Violations Form on EPA's website, epa.gov/tips. It was referred to me by an ASRC federal contractor working for the EPA. I have always included my contact information on the tip report and identified specific aircraft that can easily be traced. No one from the EPA has investigated any of my formally filed complaints. Since I became interested in the possible dangers of chemical spraying in the environment, I have contacted the Virginia Pollution Control Board, National Weather Service, Oceana and Dam Neck military bases, NOAA, NASA, the Department of Defense, Brookhaven National Laboratory, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, the Health Department, the Department of Travel, countless federal agents and operators, the Virginia Beach Police Department, and even the White House, all to no avail. To date, no one from any agency has investigated my complaints. I was told to talk to my local representatives. Every agency I contacted responded to my reports by telling me that I was seeing condensation from engine exhaust. Aircraft engines do emit water vapor, of course, but vapor that quickly dissipates. What I was witnessing was persistent and long-lasting. How can anyone reasonably conclude that a particular aircraft emission is merely a contrail without testing it? That is both unscientific and irresponsible. Chemtrails, as opposed to contrails, is the term used to describe persistent aircraft emissions. There is a rising international concern about the existence of airborne chemical spraying, bolstered by a growing body of scientific evidence. What is in the air that we are breathing? One chemtrail activist from California decided to have his hair tested for heavy metals at his own expense. High levels of strontium and barium were uncovered. I have a copy of his lab results that he voluntarily sent to me. I will post this document on my Facebook page, Madison Star Moon, following this hearing. Did this contamination come from chemical spraying? How can we know if local, state, and federal agencies refuse to take ownership of the issue to provide testing and usable data and ultimately regulate when required? The whole burden of investigation cannot rest with the EPA. It must be shared with other agencies and Congress. However, there must be clear lines of authority so that the public is fully informed and protected. The stated purpose of this hearing is to consider the full range of pollution generated by aircraft. The desire for investigation into chemical spraying has become a worldwide phenomenon. We are counting on you as the protectors of the environment to act. No more runarounds for citizens deeply concerned about the health of the world and the individuals that inhabit it. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is David Bach. I'm a fellow and attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC is a national nonprofit organization that works on all manner of environmental issues, and we represent 300,000 members nationwide. 8 days ago, Administrator McCarthy laid out a powerful case for acting on climate change. She said, "Climate change is one of the most important issues we face as a country and as citizens of the world. It affects everything we know and love, our kids, our communities, our ability to earn a decent living. It impacts our health, our safety, our livelihoods. One thing is crystal clear. Acting on this challenge is a moral responsibility." Administrator McCarthy is right. The United States has a moral obligation to rein in dangerous climate change. EPA has already shown tremendous and admirable leadership in going after emissions from cars, trucks, and now power plants. And we need to see the EPA exercise the same leadership when it comes to regulating aircraft. Airplanes are the largest unregulated source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States transportation sector. They're responsible for 11% of transportation sector emissions, 3% of total U.S. emissions, and 0.5% of total global emissions. And these emissions are skyrocketing. EPA expects nearly 50% increase between 2015 and 2035. In light of these facts, it is indisputable that aircraft emissions cause or contribute to air pollution that may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health or welfare within the meaning of Section 231. And EPA should quickly adopt this proposed finding. Thereafter, EPA must take bold action to reduce these dangerous emissions. The United States, under President Obama, has pledged to reduce economy-wide emissions by between 26 and 28% between 2005 and 2025. We must make good on this commitment. It is our moral responsibility, as Administrator McCarthy reminded us. But as the World Resources Institute has shown, we cannot do so without taking meaningful action to reduce aircraft emissions. And I include a citation in my written comments, but WRI has projected that we would need to reduce aircraft emissions by 2% to meet that target. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, EPA should propose standards that go far beyond the options currently being considered by ICAO. We would welcome meaningful international standards, and we encourage EPA to continue pushing ICAO toward greater stringency, and in particular, to encourage ICAO to adopt coverage of in-production aircraft, as others have urged EPA to do today. But given that ICAO has already committed to adopting a technology-following standard and has already ruled out the possibility of regulating existing aircraft, it is clear that the United States cannot deliver on our commitments if we simply rubber stamp the ICAO standards. EPA can and must do more. Fortunately, the Clean Air Act provides EPA with clear authority to rein in aviation emissions. As EPA recognized in 2008 in its advance notice of proposed rulemaking on regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, Section 231 of the Clean Air Act authorizes a fleet-wide averaging system that applies to both new and existing aircraft. Drawing on this authority, EPA should propose a fleet-wide averaging system that is sufficiently stringent to stabilize U.S. aviation emissions by 2020, consistent with industry's commitment, and reduce them thereafter. We know that this can be done. In 2010, at the request of then-Senator Kerry, EPA developed a scenario for stabilizing aircraft emissions at approximately 250 million metric tons per year by improving fleet-wide efficiency by 2.2% between 2015 and 2030. EPA noted that airlines have historically improved their fuel efficiency by 2 to 3% per year and concluded that similar improvements would be achievable between 2015 and 2030. The agency cited improved operations and new aircraft technology, including geared turbofan engines, laminar flow technology, lighter airframes, and blended wing body design as possible contributors to such a reduction. These operational technological improvements are clearly achievable as well as cost-effective, and we believe that EPA should use this 2010 study as a baseline in setting its proposed domestic standards. Finally, EPA should also consider the opportunity to retrofit existing aircraft. Industry leaders have already taken significant steps with cost-effective, safe retrofits. A key example here are winglets, which are wing attachments that reduce drag and improve efficiency by 3.5 to 4% per flight on trips over 1,000 nautical miles. Alaska Airlines is an industry leader, and they've recently introduced, I believe this is pronounced Scimitar winglets, S-C-I-M-I-T-A-R, the technical term, and they reduce emissions by an additional almost 2% per flight, which brings you up to about 6% total reduction. Since this technology is safe, technically feasible, and cost-effective, EPA should propose to require it across the entire fleet. And EPA should also work with the FAA to develop complementary standards to promote the use of low-carbon jet fuels that reduce life cycle GHG emissions compared to conventional fuels. Industry leaders are already using these fuels on a commercial scale. For example, Alaska Airlines has been using low-carbon biofuel on regularly scheduled flights since 2011. And United recently invested $30 million in a project to convert household trash into jet fuel, which it expects to supply enough low-carbon fuel for 20,000 flights per year at a competitive cost. Building on this work of industry leaders, EPA should work with the FAA to develop an ambitious but achievable low-carbon fuel standard to complement its 231 emission standard. In conclusion, EPA should adopt its proposed endangerment finding as expeditiously as possible. The science here is indisputable. Next, EPA should continue pushing ICAO toward greater stringency, including coverage of in-production aircraft. However, it should also prepare to propose standards that go far beyond the options the organization is considering. Specifically, EPA should propose a fleet-wide averaging system that is sufficiently stringent to stabilize U.S. aviation emissions at 2005 levels by 2020 and reduce them significantly thereafter. EPA should consider retrofit options, including the possibility of requiring airlines to use winglets on their entire fleet. And EPA should work with the FAA to develop a low-carbon fuel standard. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you all for your thoughtful comments. I'd now like to ask and invite up our last two speakers, registered speakers for today, Patrick Roddy and Max Bliss. Patrick and Max.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay. My name is Patrick Roddy. I'm a San Francisco-based anti-geoengineering activist and researcher, and I run StopSprayingUs-SF.com. Today's hearing is supposed to address whether greenhouse gas emissions from aircraft endanger public health. But when you mention greenhouse gas, most people think of carbon dioxide, a harmless trace gas essential to all life on Earth. But CO2 represents just 3% of the planet's greenhouse gas. 95% of it is water. Even preschoolers know overcast skies make the nights warmer and the days cooler. Clouds insulate, trapping heat, and reduce the temperature range of the night's lows to the day's highs. Which brings me to persistent contrails. All but the willfully ignorant know our skies have changed dramatically over the last few decades. The dark blue skies of our childhood have been replaced with a milky white haze, crisscrossed with fast-expanding persistent contrails, stretching from horizon to horizon and spreading out to cover the sky. These trails can stretch for thousands of miles and can be seen by anyone visiting nasa.gov. These trails persist regardless of altitude, temperature, humidity, or other atmospheric conditions. Persistent contrails used to be rare, but have now become an everyday phenomenon all over the world. If physics hasn't changed, what has? So what makes these trails form, persist for hours, and stretch thousands of miles? Which condensation nuclei are they forming on, and are these harmful to human health? Geoengineers propose spraying tens of millions of tons of reflective particles into the atmosphere in an attempt to reflect sunlight back into space and thereby reduce global warming. This is known as solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, or albedo modification. This process, patented by defense contractor Raytheon, is quite simple. Tiny particles sprayed from jets would act as condensation nuclei, attracting atmospheric water vapor to form persistent artificially nucleated contrails, which would then spread out and form artificial cirrus cloud cover. When geoengineers discuss solar radiation management in public, the only substances they say they'd consider spraying are sulfates or sulfuric acid. However, their own literature concludes that sulfates have limited effectiveness and that highly toxic nanoparticles of aluminum and barium should be used instead. And when confronted, they doggedly refuse to address the human health impacts of their proposals. Other geoengineers are more candid about their plans to poison the sky. Stanford's Ken Caldera admitted in an interview in 2006 that he discussed putting pathogens in clouds to wage chemical and germ warfare on civilian populations when he worked at a government weapons lab. It's no surprise that the public doubts these scientists have their best interests at heart. Last month, I brought this paper to the Paris Climate Conference addressing the human health impacts of proposed geoengineering solutions. I formally request it be entered into the record. It documents the dramatic increase in Alzheimer's and respiratory failure since the 1990s, when persistent contrails became commonplace around the world. I conclude that these persistent contrails are, in fact, artificially nucleated with the same toxic particulate metals outlined in Raytheon's patent, and that a solar radiation management program has been deployed since at least the 1990s. Weather modification research is nothing new. The earliest patent dates back to 1920. Raytheon's patent proposes reducing global warming by injecting aluminum, thorium, and other metallic oxides in the 10 to 100 micron range into the stratosphere using jet exhaust. The US Navy patented another delivery method which forms artificially nucleated contrails from metal oxides with a 0.3 micron particle size. Other methods include airships, rockets, chimneys, and slurry pipes. The best-known proponent of solar radiation management is Dr. David Keith. He told the 2010 annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science that aluminum oxide has 4 times the volumetric radiative forcing for small particles as does sulfur, and 16 times less the coagulation rate. Sulfur particles stick together and quickly fall out of the stratosphere and are much less effective per unit mass. He also said a nanofabrication study proved it was very simple to spray high-quality alumina particles from a plane by injecting alumina vapor into the exhaust. His 2010 paper, Photophoretic Levitation of Engineered Aerosols for Geoengineering, proposes spraying 50 nanometer thick disks of aluminum, barium, titanium instead of sulfates. Pope et al. Also concluded aluminum nanoparticles are much more effective than sulfates in a 2010 perspective in Nature Climate Change. The material safety data sheet for nanoparticulate aluminum states it's an irritant to the respiratory system, is implicated in Alzheimer's disease, can cause pulmonary disease, tumors, neoplasms, and should not be released into the environment without proper governmental permits. Alzheimer's disease rose to the 6th leading cause of death in the United States from the 8th between 1999 and 2013. In 1994, it didn't even make the top 10. Now people in their 20s are showing signs of Alzheimer's. Research shows that aluminum accumulates in the brain, bones, and kidneys, is a neurotoxin, accelerates brain aging, increases oxidative stress and inflammation of the brain, and is 7 times more bioavailable when inhaled than when ingested orally. Barium is much deadlier. According to its material safety data sheet, exposure to barium salts can cause pulmonary arrest, vomiting, diarrhea, convulsive tremors, muscular paralysis, shock, convulsions, and sudden cardiac failure. Barium targets the cardiovascular, nervous, gastrointestinal, hematology, respiratory, reproductive, and renal systems, as well as the adrenal glands and liver. It is also an irritant to the skin and should not be released into the environment. In 2011, respiratory failure overtook stroke to become the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States, at a time when smoking was at an all-time low, emission standards on vehicles and power plants were at their strictest, and heavy industry had relocated to China. Hundreds of scientific papers thoroughly prove the toxicity of both aluminum and barium. It would take days to cover a fraction of the proof. According to EPA, particulate pollution can cause early death from heart attack, stroke, congestive heart failure, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It also causes asthma and inflammation of lung tissue and may cause cancer, reproductive and developmental harm. Particulate pollution can lower life expectancy by 1 to 3 years. Water and ice have refractive indices of 1.333 and 1.309 respectively, and produce rainbows with an angular radius of 42 degrees centered on the antisolar point. But in recent years, a formerly rare phenomenon has become commonplace, a 21-degree halo completely encircling the Sun. Some argue that these halos, or incredibly rare sundogs, are formed by ice crystals, but nothing can change the refractive index of water and ice, which forms 42-degree halos. Metal salts have a higher refractive index and therefore form much tighter halos. Crystalline aluminum oxide, for example, has a refractive index of 1.762 to 1.778, while barium sulfate has a refractive index of 1.636. My contention that these incredibly rare sundogs are in fact formed by metal salts with a higher refractive index than water is reinforced by rainwater analysis taken during a 30-day period when I recorded 21 of these halos in March-April 2015. I collected rainwater in clean glass bowls on the roof of my San Francisco apartment building on April 5th, 6,000 miles downwind from the nearest factory, power plant, refinery, freeway, quarry or mine. I sent it to a NELAP certified lab and they recorded barium at a staggering 160 micrograms per liter. Less than 1 gram will kill an adult human. An earlier test of rainwater collected in January 14 recorded aluminum at 190 micrograms per liter. I submit both these rainwater tests for the record. San Francisco's air should be pristine. We get prevailing winds off the Pacific Ocean. Why is it left to concerned citizens to pay for our own rainwater analysis? And why did EPA stop publishing data on airborne aluminum back in 2002? Let me take this opportunity to formally submit a Freedom of Information request for EPA to release the historical results of all metal tests in our air and rainwater from the 1980s to present. I've recorded hundreds of time-lapse videos showing the progression of these persistent contrails since 2011. Thousands of others worldwide have also documented the alarming increase of these persistent contrails. Thousands of others worldwide have also documented the alarming increase of these persistent contrails and been met with deafening silence from supposedly green organizations like Greenpeace, who are a proud member in the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, and all governmental agencies, including EPA. Your mandate is to protect the environment, especially the air we breathe. I wouldn't expect you to admit the existence of a program as covert as the Manhattan Project, even one blatantly obvious to an increasingly aware and outraged populace. But when a geoengineering program is causing millions of premature deaths a year, you must do more than pass the buck back and forth between other three-letter agencies. Do your job. History will judge you on your actions or inaction.
Firstly, I would like to thank the organisers for making this hearing possible, to thank the other contributors, and a very big thank you to those that have helped with the vital funding to make my trip possible. My name is Max Bliss. I am no scientist. In fact, I'm a general builder who has worked outside all my life. After moving to the southwest of France in 2009 to a region famed for high sunshine hours and big blue skies, I became increasingly aware of the incredible increase in contrails and associated cloud cover. I began to notice this daily, and this greatly troubled me. I started to photograph and film the sky now for 4 years. Barely a day goes by without seeing various contrails, some thick, spreading, but most alarming is watching spurts within contrails, some watching the sky blotted out. Subsequently, I wanted to learn more and became an avid researcher and a passionate environmentalist. I have attended and participated in various high-level climate change and climate engineering conferences. With respect to this hearing on the proposed finding of greenhouse gases from aircraft cause or contribute to air pollution that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare, the major component, 95% of greenhouse gas, is water vapour, together with other constituents from exhaust or ejected particulate matter from aircraft form contrails, contrail cirrus, haziness, and cloud blankets, which certainly do affect changes to the weather, altering rainfall, altering temperatures, inducing droughts, reducing frosts, etc., and ultimately affecting climate change. When the planes were grounded following 9/11 and later in the UK in 2010, there were obviously no contrails. The sky cleared of clouds and natural clear blue sky returned, confirming aviation is affecting cloud cover. According to various investigations, such as the 1998 Subsonic Contrail and Clouds Effects Special Study, they have noted that apart from water and CO2, there are metal particles including zinc, aluminium and titanium, also soot, sulfates, etc., found in the exhaust plumes, contributing as nuclei for ice crystals to form contrails. A 2010 study for the Wright-Patterson Air Force Research Laboratory entitled Nano-Sized Aluminium Altered Immune Function opens the abstract with this sentence: on the basis of their uses in jet fuels, munitions, and the most likely scenario for aluminium nanoparticle exposure is inhalation. The UK Civil Aviation Authority responded to the concerns of fume incidents. The 2004 investigation into cabin air quality found that the peak particulate matter found in the air ducts was aluminium. Although the study does hypothesize that this may be from the heated engine lubricating oils contaminating the air supply via the air bleed valve, it is worthy to note that 50% of the cabin air comes from the atmosphere, and as planes often fly through contrails or the aerosols left by other planes, I feel investigation into the presence of nanoparticles in the troposphere from planes, although very difficult, must be initiated as soon as possible. Many hundreds of pilots and frequent flyers report debilitating illnesses linked to cabin air. Please refer to aerotoxic syndrome. There are many new studies emerging on the links with aluminium and Alzheimer's dementia and various other serious ailments in humans, animals, whales, fish, and even bees. Plants, trees, and all life is affected by aluminium toxicity. Recently, the media has announced that 1 in 3 seniors will die with Alzheimer's. It just becomes clearer with research that nanoparticles may already be in jet fuels and are certainly planned for implementation in the near future, and also, for that matter, in biodiesel. Aluminium oxide not only has potential negative health impacts, it is also known to contribute to making clouds, as it is used in tracer rockets for NASA. Aluminium oxide has been suggested by geoengineers for solar radiation management, but is known to damage the ozone. Aluminium is a cation and is mentioned in weather modification patents, although there are hundreds of weather modification patents using various methods and ingredients. In a 1956 US patent 2756097 for weather control, the author states, "We have discovered that quantities of very dry superheated water vapor will disturb the thermal and electrical balances of cloud formation, causing dissipation or precipitation. We accomplished this process of our invention by injecting water or water solutions of ionic salts into heated exhaust gases of a power plant, such as internal combustion engine, jet engine, and the like." Through investigation into the huge disturbing increases in contrails, associated cloud covers, and changes to the weather, one will be left wondering if this indeed is intentional or deliberate, as the extra contrails and cloud generation is excessive in correlation with the increase in growing aviation use. I have taken pictures of nozzles in line with the engines on pylons. These are described as oil drain masks, but some patents of similar nozzles state other material can be evacuated from them. Even if oil was leaked out into the hot exhaust plume, smoke would be generated, and smoke is used for cloud seeding for weather modification. A 1970 paper by Wallace B. McRae on the possibility of weather modification by aircraft contrails, he describes how the ice crystals formed in contrails effectively can seed cloud decks below as ice crystals survive falling to lower cloud deck altitudes, increasing cloud cover as effectively as dry ice cloud seeding. McRae writes, "Possible consequences of this are considerable. In fact, it seems probable that one of the projects for modifying the global climate discussed by Fletcher in 1965, namely modification of cloud cover over the North Polar Basin by cloud seeding, is already underway." Up until the mid-1970s, documents suggest the establishment desire was to intentionally melt the Arctic sea ice, to free up shipping lanes, access rich resources and open up vast regions of ice-locked land. And adversely, climate changes could likely be blamed on the anthropogenic global warming to instigate the beginning of global governance through United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Programme to create the New World Order. Interestingly, when one begins to research the history of weather and climate modification, it is surprising how far up the power structure the desire for developing a large-scale weather and climate modification program was, from Presidents Eisenhower, JFK, Johnson, onwards, with a high priority put on these possibilities. The Johnson administration was using weather modification for geopolitical leverage with India and Pakistan in 1967. Would we be naive to think that the interest just went away because of the NMOD treaty? Look up Owning the Weather 2025. In conclusion, pollutants from aircraft that need prohibitions such as sulfates or the use of any nanoparticles that which can travel via the air from a source of combustion into life organisms is causing serious negative health impacts to many forms of life. This needs to be tightly regulated and ultimately stopped. The notion that the climate science is settled is often repeated over and over by interested stakeholders such as those looking for lucrative funding in the burgeoning climate change arena, be it academics, politicians or entrepreneurs looking for success or to get rich, or more darkly, hoping to implement a one-world government system. Climate has always had natural variability and weather extremes. However, these days, some weather extremes can be stimulated with technology. Is it appropriate to reassess the anthropogenic global warming theory and replace it with climate change is man-made by using covert weather and climate modification technology known as geoengineering for geopolitical ends? We do not need to be scientists to observe the sky and see the obvious negative effects aviation is having and research the spiralling health impacts. Just start looking up and wake up. We do not consent to the use of weather and climate modification or the despotic New World Order. God bless and peace for all.
Thank you both for your comments. I believe, unless there's additional registrants that have come in since a few minutes ago, we have concluded our hearing for today. On behalf of the whole panel and the EPA, I'd like to thank everybody for your thoughtful comments and suggestions today. I want to remind everybody, as I said at the outset, the comment period officially closes on this action on August 31st at 11:59. So we encourage written comments. We want additional information and anything you can provide. So thank you all for taking time today. We appreciate it, and we'll hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.